together this talk, I was trying to think through like what do I want folks to take away? And so this is more just a distillation of how I've been thinking about the problem and sort of where I see us as an ecosystem. I wanted to seed a couple thoughts then. So like as we're moving into FDS and people showing up in person, what are the types of discussions that I think we should be having? And then more specifically, I think there's two areas where I'd love for us to problem solve. So I will leave it as like open challenges for us to tackle in person. But hopefully, coming out of this talk, if we're aligned on like what is the problem statement, what are the rough shapes of things that might solve these problems, I think I would consider it a success. So maybe to start though, we can start with the talk that Juan had given previously on value accrual. I think he presents it in three forms. The first is sort of looking at Bitcoin. And so if you think of Bitcoin's like value accrual loop, you have sort of like the proof of work security down here, which creates sort of this narrative around a decentralized store of value, sort of backed by energy, that gives value to the token rewards, which then can sort of reward the proof of work, which gives you this nice little loop. And so there's like a strong tie in that ecosystem around sort of the narrative value of like 21 million backed by energy, proof of work, yada, yada. And you contrast that to something like an Ethereum or a Solana, which I'll call L1s in general, and you sort of have a similar loop, but given many of them are proof of stake, a lot of this actual value loop is tied more to the internal services. So the internal services sort of being like selling block space, having people pay for either execution fees or storage fees, or just being in the same block as other things. So like prioritization. But that sort of same demand loop can be satisfied not just from like an external narrative, but from people paying to use the services of whatever else is co-located on that network. And so it makes for an interesting question for Filecoin and where do we see our positioning? Like Bitcoin and has like a first mover advantage on sort of this like proof of work and sort of store of value network or story. Ethereum and Solana and the other L1s have a story really around sort of like the actual utilizations of their network. And I think for Filecoin, if we simply just try to say like yes and to each of these, I think we fall short because the others exist. And so my claim, and I think this is a claim that a lot of other people in the ecosystem subscribe to, is external services is our path there, where we actually sell Filecoin storage or Filecoin backed services as part of like the longer term value accrual story. But I think if we double click into this, then there's two questions that this raises. Like one, how are we connecting that specific action to like the actual value accrual story? And two, how does this actually work in a world of L2s? And how do we make sure that as L2s are sort of forming, and especially if they are one of the larger bets for demand generation, how do we make sure that those grow up in a symbiotic or an aligned way? Um, I think the other mental model that's maybe worth just all of us having in the back of our heads is sort of this picture that Juan has showed before, sort of like how does the value flow throughout the Filecoin economy? The green arrows here are things that cause value to flow into the Filecoin economy, people buying Phil to go do some stuff. So this happens when like Filecoin is actually like pulling value in for pushing other services out into the world. The more that we can generate internal transactions, we can sort of like create like locking, we can create more internal demand for the ecosystem. Obviously, things like consumptive things. So think of them like the taxes, where we're paying like gas fees and things like that, that sort of remove Filecoin from circulation and that like permanently remove them. And then, of course, the imports where Filecoin is being used to fund some external thing, whether that be like the OPEX, the CAPEX, and so on. Um, the reason I think this is important is as we think about our full value loop and the external services that we want to sell, figuring out how do we measure and how do we increase the balance of trade, so to speak, so that Phil is connecting more to the actual value capture loop and not just being like passively on the side. And I think like an important part also to keep in mind is like external to our ecosystem. I know we sometimes rabbit hole on how we think about the problems. I think it's worth us just connecting back to like how is the broader world looking at crypto? I don't know if folks listen to like the Blockworks podcast with the CIO of BlackRock. It was interesting because one of the parts she was talking about was how do they try to come up with valuation frameworks outside of like or for token networks outside of Bitcoin. And I think it's a pretty open question. And I think the world is looking for like good answers on how they do this. I would claim that you can separate out like the speculative value of like people pricing in future growth versus like the quote unquote sustainable value, what are like recurring services that are being built out. But then I think you also see narratives forming around like the quality of the flows. For other L1s, people are talking about this in terms of like what type of non sort of like meme coin activity is happening. You see it in terms of people talking about like payments and sort of like stable coins overall. And I think like stablecoin legislation as like another thing that may change what is like the set of activity that easily happens inside of crypto rails. I think these are all sort of like general trends that are going on. So then, more specifically about Filecoin, what is going on in our world? I think we have a couple of comparative advantages as an ecosystem compared to like the broader world. One is we still are like a quite hardware heavy network, which I think is unique, especially among DePIN networks in terms of like the total aggregate value of the capital that we have. We have a large brand, we have distribution. Uh, I think one of the things that I think we're also uniquely ahead of is just like thinking about this revenue question and like how do we get real cash flows into our economy. Comparative disadvantages is we are a different L1 than a lot of other networks. So like when you think about DePIN networks building on Solana, it's not like they natively want to choose Filecoin because it's not like we have the home team advantage of being aligned with another ecosystem. I think another thing that strategically we have to think through, especially if we're betting on speculative value, is our 30-second block time, our slower finality, even post F3. I think it changes the UX, which makes it harder to go after certain types of use cases. And then, of course, as we think about DeFi and like the levered capital flows, I think we have a cold start problem. And I think like the ecosystem writ large is sort of in this show me phase of people having heard a lot of narratives, but now looking to see evidence of the traction. And so I think that leads to then what are our areas for growth? Not all hardware is equally productive. And I think that's been a whole conversation we've had about Phil Plus and things like that. But I think it's also critical then to focus on what are the metrics that we need to measure, which is really, in my view, just how do we generate more revenue that's showing up on chain? Because that's the stuff that people will actually believe is like happening. They're not just going through like people's anecdata. And then two, I think like we need to think through like for L2 specifically, how do we make sure that the L2 value capture is happening symbiotically? So it's getting accrued also into the broader Filecoin story and not just separate from Filecoin writ large. So I have a three-step pitch for how we can maximize these things. So my first is that we need basically to solve for this one statement, which is lots of non-speculative value settling on chain with growth rates that are offsetting inflation. Two, once we have that, we can start building up derivative businesses to capture more of those value flows. And three, once the flywheel starts turning, we can expand the TAM of one to go back and increase the set of things that we're addressing. Sorry, I'm rushing now because I realize I have 2 minutes left and I still have quite a number of slides. Um, but for how to sustainably grow the economy, I just want to break apart each of these three statements. For non-speculative, I think like all of this goes into the work that people have been doing for how do we just reduce the costs. I think our frame of reference here should be like things that productively monetize the hard drives on the Filecoin network, or I guess we could even broaden it to the other resources that are tied to the Filecoin proof generation process. That could be scaling as a service, that could be things that allow storage providers to run compute jobs, that could be like increasing the utilization. But I would put things like Ramo as an example, and also a lot of the L2s, which make it easier for storage providers to just turn on a money generation switch to pull like fiat cash flows into their hard drives. Settling on chain, I think one of the reasons this matters is both for a measurement thing, but two, I think it's like a thing that we need to solve for is the fragmentation risk, both with like the L2s and different subnets that may uh, cause like fracturing. If we don't have a good story of like where does the settlement happen, I think we end up having like a world of three or four different ecosystems that are all kind of like not talking to each other as closely as they could be. There's also a narrative confusion risk of like if Phil is not seen as like the default currency in the economy at large, I think then there's a question of like kind of what ETH is facing today. Does value accrue to L2s or does it accrue to ETH? And I think the answer is value has to accrue to both, but we need to just figure out what the split should be. And then the offsetting inflation thing, I think this is more a function of like how our tokenomics works today. I think one of the reasons people I think have a harder time sort of like rationalizing where Filecoin is and where it should be is just based on like the fact that we have a complicated set of tokenomics with our baseline minting and simple minting. Although that may get simpler as like vesting ends in 2026 as we converge to simple minting, I think it's still stuff that we have to think through because I think those are part of what I think causes people to have a little bit of concern when they're looking at the Filecoin tokenomics. I would argue that the biggest gaps that we have right now are on payments. First, with payments, is like we don't have a good connection loop between like how payments happen. I know Juan will talk about stable coins. We have stuff with USDFC. I think part of what we need to think through there is not just like the existence of a stable coin, though. It's really through the full product considerations of like why should payments happen on chain. Right now, the friction is high. Clients may or may not be crypto native. We need to make sure that there's like a good enough reason for SPs to demand to do it. But I would claim that those are challenges, not like blockers. And so for us to think about this, it should be like, how can we make these the rational choices for people to pay on chain? And that could be a call to action for some of the centralized lenders, as well as DeFi protocols, where maybe payments on chain lead to better loan terms for borrowing fill, better fees if we're thinking through like how we might make adjustments with things like FWS. And then even for like L2s, I think setting up the incentives for them to want to settle their payments on chain in fill is like another question. And then incentives for L2s, I think one set of challenges that we need to like think through is like all of these L2s are going to be going out for fundraising. I think they will be pushed to have their own token. They will be pushed to have their own narrative. And I think if we don't get ahead of this question and solve for what is like the value symbiotic version of like an L2's incentives and an L1's incentives, I think we're naturally going to have a lot of like confusion. And I think it's going to be bad for everyone involved. And so I think an opportunity, though, is for us to think about like how can we use our token incentives to support the L2s. I have a whole pitch, which I guess I'm now over time, but a pitch on how we can think about using subnets and like QAP as a concept to help bring revenue to L2s, but doing it in a way that allows us to define what is an aligned L2 so that it's symbiotic for both groups. But we could talk about this more live in FDS, so please find me if this is something that's of interest to you. But bigger picture, I think it's worth just like zooming out and taking a moment to look at one, for Filecoin to be successful, I think we need to have and grow our non-speculative value flows. I think in order for this, there's lots of like disjointed efforts, I think, on this that are capturing different parts of the problem. I think if we want to make this much more cohesive, part of what we need to do is look at that full economic loop and measure basically where are we leaking value out of the pipeline and figure out how we tighten them. I think separate from that, we also have to look at L2s and think about how can we make it easy for them to do the aligned things and not end up in a situation that looks a little bit more like ETH land, where all of these L2s now in ETH land, I think people are questioning like, what is the ecosystem strategy? How are these things aligned and so on? I think if we can come up with how we can use our tokenomics to align the L2s directly to the L1, I think everything is great. And I think if we do all of these things correctly, we've already done a lot of the heavy lifting on the product side, but I think it makes Filecoin a much more attractive story overall. That is my rushed ending to this talk. But if this is of interest and people want to talk more about it, please find me at FDS. And yeah, we can dig in more. I want to have a lot of sessions talking about this because I think it's the most critical problem in the ecosystem.